Hi, Dr. Lamb here again with part two of task two, which is assessment. As we look to completing this session, uh, we're going to be choosing at least two of these three assessments. You're not required to do all three, although all three might fit quite neatly into your lesson plan. You're only required to do two. Okay, so we have the pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. Let's look at pre-assessment. This, of course, is directed towards gathering information about where your students are prior to the lesson. So what are you going to be doing to identify uh, how much it is that your students already know before you begin this lesson? This could include what they've done in class prior to this lesson, maybe with your field experience teacher, the buildup of labs or um, even lecture materials that your field experience teacher has already done with these students could be a part of this pre-assessment. What information can you get from your field experience teacher themselves about the readiness of your students for the current lesson that you're going to be teaching? Make sure that any pre-assessment that you do, that each question of the assessment uh, is aligned to the standards or the objectives that you set for the lesson. And of course, you want to make sure that if you've identified any specific needs in your context for learning, an IEP or a 504 plan, uh, any adaptation that you have to make to the pre-assessment regarding those should also be noted. Notice we're talking about this section here of your template. Again, you'll need to pick two of the options, and there's the pre-assessment option. Okay. Next is formative assessment. Formative assessment is what is used to monitor how your students are going through the lesson. So what is your plan to do that? How are you going to monitor your students during the lesson? What kinds of feedback are you going to provide to your students, both positive feedback, encouraging positive feedback, as well as any kind of critique that you're going to be giving them? Do you have things built into your lesson to identify needs that your students have if they're not quite keeping up with your lesson? And how would you identify that? Does your field experience teacher have strategies built into the class structure? So some teachers already have systems that they have set up with their students throughout the course of the school year to identify those kinds of needs that the students have and whether they're understanding what's going on in the class. So make sure you check with your field experience teacher. And what feedback are you giving the students during the lesson? Again, make sure that this formative assessment is aligned to the standards or objectives that you set at the beginning, and that you identify any of those needs that you specified in your context for learning. Next is summative feedback. This section on your template. How will you know your students learned what you wanted them to learn? What are you going to put into place to measure the effectiveness of your lesson? Explain how the assessment you choose is going to provide you that evidence that you need for student learning. Just because you give a test doesn't mean that the test itself is just automatically going to measure what you want it to measure. You need to make sure and identify how it's going to do that. How is it that it addresses those objectives? What questions are you going to ask? Or it could be a skill that you're going to have the students perform. In either case, how is either successfully answering those questions or successfully promoting or doing the skill that you ask them to do, how is that going to demonstrate mastery of the topic that you had set out to teach? You can certainly give a 10-question quiz that the students get all 10 of the questions right, and those 10 questions not give you any information as to whether or not they understood the objective of your lesson. So be very conscious about the questions you're asking, and that they are set to the learning objectives. And finally, again, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that each of those assessment items needs to be aligned to the standard or learning objectives that you identified as the focus of the lesson, and be sure that you address any kind of adaptation or adjustment that you have to make or that you're going to provide for in your assessment for the IEPs, the 504s, any diverse learner needs that you identified in your context for learning and in the previous section, so you can be sure that those are accommodated. All right, good luck.